Under the new covenant, we're free from the law. But according to Paul in Galatians 3:24, the law is our schoolmaster. The law is our tutor. And because of this, we heed the law as a reliable authority, a reliable source of information about the mind of God. So we pay attention, for instance, when we encounter passages like Deuteronomy 18:9-13, where Moses tells the children of Israel, "When you enter the land the Lord your God is giving you, do not learn to imitate the detestable ways of the nations there. Let no one be found among you who sacrifices their son or daughter in the fire, who practices divination or sorcery, interprets omens, engages in witchcraft or casts spells, or who is a medium or spiritualist who consults the dead. Anyone who does these things is detestable to the Lord. Because of these same detestable practices, the Lord your God will drive out those nations before you. But you must be blameless before the Lord your God." And because of passages like this, most Christians are conscientious about steering clear of the dark arts or any kind of augurative, incantatory, talismanic, or thaumaturgical practices that do not find their origins in the pages of Holy Scripture. Indeed, we are skittish even about such things that seem to meet with God's approval, such as the casting of lots, as the apostles did in Acts 1 to select a successor for Judas. And this, I think, is as it should be, because the allure of things occultic is subtle and pervasive. Now, it's up to each one of us, as Christians, possessed of the liberty that Christ has given us, to figure out where to draw the line for ourselves. Personally, I feel free at ease, for instance, to eat Lucky Charms without the slightest bit of spiritual compunction or fear that I shall be led away from my faith, despite the fact that the spokeshob for this product, an animistic imp, a leprechaun, and the manufacturer, General Mills, actively promotes folklore touting the supposed talismanic qualities of each of the marshmallow charm shapes. Because I know that they are not, in fact, magically delicious. The flavor is unnatural, but it isn't supernatural. And I'm no more likely to become a pagan by eating Lucky Charms than I am to become a vampire by eating Count Chocula. A flesh golem by eating frankenberries, a ghost by eating blueberries, or an alien by eating quisp, or an athlete by eating Wheaties. And I have no qualms about reading fortune cookies, making birthday wishes, flipping coins, playing Yahtzee, or watching Wheel of Fortune on television. But you'll never catch me consulting a medium, or playing with a Ouija board, or gazing into a crystal ball, because God has consistently and unambiguously condemned such things. But there's one kind of extra-biblical, even extra-ecclesiastical consultation that God seems to approve. In Romans 1:18-20, Paul tells us, "For the disposition of God in regard to every kind of secularism and unrighteousness of the human race, specifically in regard to those who suppress the truth for the sake of unrighteousness, is made evident in the environment itself. For what may be known about God is evident to everyone, because God has made it evident to everyone. For since the creation of the universe, his invisible attributes, his eternal power, and his divine nature have been readily perceptible in the things that have been made. Thus, they have no defense." According to the Bible, we have a data set available to us, which is a reliable source of information about God and about the things of God, the created order. This is why I'm persuaded that Christians ought to be pro-science, because scientific inquiry, properly conducted, is nothing other than the disciplined study of natural revelation. And natural revelation is thoroughgoingly and unequivocally biblical. Now, I don't have time to make that case this morning. I spent 16 weeks on that subject a few years ago in lessons number 311 through 327 in the Life of Christ series, and those are available online. For the purposes of today's lesson, we're taking it as an established matter of faith and sound doctrine that the creation testifies truthfully and reliably about the things of God. And that brings us to today's lesson, because today I want to talk about the study of the behavior of the heavenly bodies, as from the perspective of Earth, they move about in the sky. Because this field of inquiry, astronomy, stands alone among its fellows in that it lends itself to spiritual interpretation. It lends itself to a particular kind of augury known as astrology. But unlike all other such arts that I've mentioned this morning, the practice of astrology appears to have God's stamp of approval, at least on a limited basis. Now, to be sure, the Lord cautions us against any kind of astrology, any kind of worship or veneration of heavenly bodies. As Moses tells the children of Israel in Deuteronomy 17, 2 through 5, if anyone living among you in one of the towns the Lord gives you is found doing evil in the eyes of the Lord your God in violation of his covenant, and contrary to my command has worshipped other gods, bowing down to them, or to the sun, or the moon, or the stars in the sky, and this has been brought to your attention, then you must investigate it thoroughly. If it is true, and it has been proved that this detestable thing has been done in Israel, take the one who has done this evil deed to your city gate and stone that person to death. Likewise, Paul condemns the same in Romans 1:25, where he derogates those who worship natural things, saying they exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshipped and served the creation rather than the Creator, who is forever praised. And in the book of Daniel, we'll read a half dozen times about the powers afforded to astrologers and how it is that they do not compare favorably with the powers God has given to his prophets. As we read also in Isaiah 47:13, thou art wearied in the multitude of thy counsels. Now let the astrologers, the stargazers, the monthly prognosticators stand up and save thee from these things that shall come upon thee. So we're duly cautioned against allowing enthusiasm for stargazing to grow out of proportion to its actual value to God and to the kingdom. But make no mistake about it, the ability to discern the stars has definite value in the realm of the kingdom, because God ordained from the very beginning that we look to the stars that they might reveal to us things that God has appointed them to reveal. Genesis 1:14 through 18, and God said, let there be lights at set points in the heavens to serve as indices between days and between nights, and let them serve to mark signs and seasons and days and years. And let there be lights at set points in the heavens to shed light upon the earth. And it was so. God made the two great lights, the greater light to govern the day, the lesser light to govern the night, along with the stars. And God set them at appointed places in the heavens to shed light on the earth, to govern the day and the night, and to serve as indices between lights and between darknesses. From the very beginning, God ordained that every day and every night be astrologically discernible from the one before it and the one after it, and that the differences between days and night be indexed by the sun, moon, and stars, and that these indices would serve to mark signs and seasons and days and years. And he intended for the knowledge revealed by the sun, moon, and stars to be available to all the peoples of the earth. The revelation of the heavenly bodies was not to be covenantal or proprietary, but general revelation, a revelation of the sort that Paul speaks of in Romans 1. As Moses tells the children of Israel in Deuteronomy 4:19, and beware lest you raise your eyes to heaven, and when you see the sun and the moon and the stars, all of the hosts of heaven, you be drawn away and bow down to them and serve them. For the Lord your God has granted equal access to these for all the peoples under the whole heaven. God doesn't say, don't look. What he says is, when you look, don't be enticed to idolatry. For though the stars have been set in place by his hand, they themselves are not supernatural, but natural, and are not to be worshipped, only studied. Because the knowledge revealed to us in the stars is natural revelation, revelation of the type that ought to be readily apparent to anyone who chooses to look. Again, as Paul says in Romans 1:20, for since the creation of the universe, his invisible attributes, his eternal power, and his divine nature have been readily perceptible in the things that have been made. And according to the Bible, one of the components of God's revelation in the stars is the constellations. Job 9:8-9, he alone stretches out the heavens and treads on the waves of the sea. He is the maker of Ursa Major and Orion and the Pleiades and the constellations of the south. Job 26:23, by his spirit he spread out the canopy of the heavens, and with his hands he formed Draco, the crooked serpent. And God didn't just make the constellations, he orders their movements. In Job 38:31-32, God asked Job, can you bind the chains of the Pleiades? Can you loosen Orion's belt? Can you lead forth the constellations in their seasons, or guide Ursus with her cubs? So the constellations are not a product of the imaginations of men, but of the imagination of God. And according to Genesis 1, he set them in place in order to index seasons, days, and years. Now, before I go any further, I want to mention here that I've chosen this word index very carefully because the sun, moon, and stars are not causes. The heavenly bodies are not intentional forces, and they do not have the power to cause anything on earth to happen any more than a clock can cause the sun to rise or set. But if you know how to tell time, the hands of a clock can alert you to when the sun will rise and set. And in the same way, to those who know how to read the stars, the heavens can alert them to the hands of God at work in the world around us. In lesson number 351 in the Life of Christ series, What is Truth?, we took a look at the significance of the question that Pilate asked when he famously inquired of the Lord in John 18:38, what is truth? And we established that truth is that which corresponds to reality as reality is perceived by God. And to illustrate that point, I evoked the birth of Christ and the death of Christ, because the birth of Christ and the death of Christ has something in common. They both took place on dates indicated by the stars and recoverable through the study of the same. And God spends enough time marking these dates that it seems apparent to me that he wanted us to know them. In Matthew 2:1-12, we find the following. Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose, and have come to worship him. When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And assembling all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. And they told him, in Bethlehem of Judea, for so it is written by the prophets. And you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for you shall become a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. Then Herod summoned the wise men secretly and ascertained from them what time the star had appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word, that I too may come and worship him." After listening to the king, they went on their way, and behold, the star that they had seen when it rose went before them until it came to rest over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. And going into the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they fell down and worshipped him. Then, opening their treasures, they offered him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And being warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they departed to their own country by another way. Now, the word that's translated wise man here is the word magos, magi, which refers to teachers, priests, seers, soothsayers, who were skilled astronomers and knew how to interpret what they observed in the heavens. That is, they were astrologers, specifically, I'll try to get this right, specifically genethologists, stargazers who specialize in watching the stars, looking for signs of important births. And this was not considered a trifling exercise, as astrology is in our current culture today. No, this was considered science, and its practitioners were highly regarded among academics and scholars in the ancient Near East. The wise men were learned men. They were well read, and they had access to books from all over the known world, including the Old Testament. Remember, in 300 BC, Ptolemy I began collecting volumes for the library at Alexandria. And the sages from the East were both great contributors to that library and consumers of it. And the works that the wise men had access to through this library, among them was the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. And they knew it. They studied it. They knew it well. And based on what they had found in its pages, they had worked out elaborate astrological charts for the nation of Israel. Because in the Old Testament, they found symbols representing the 12 tribes of Israel, which to their minds corresponded to the 12 star signs of the zodiac. So, drawing in part from the blessings that Jacob gave to his sons in Genesis 49, and in part on the cardinal orientation of the 12 tribes during the sojourn in the desert, with 3 tribes to the north, 3 to the south, 3 to the east, and 3 to the west, and in part on the 4-faced figure in the vision of Ezekiel, with each face representing one of the 4 fixed signs of the zodiac. A number of astrologers in the East had established a direct correspondence between the 12 tribes of Israel and the 12 signs of the zodiac. I don't have time to go into all of that this morning, but just for the purposes of today's lesson, know this: Jesus is of the tribe of Judah, and in the blessings of Genesis 49, Israel describes Jesus as the Lion of Judah. Thus, Judah was associated in Eastern astrology with the constellation of Leo. Moreover, the tribe of Judah was the principal tribe stationed to the east of the tabernacle in the desert, and Leo is the principal constellation of the east. In fact, in astrological language, to refer to the east is to refer to Leo. And that makes sense. Matthew tells us that the wise men were from the east, and that they came westward toward Jerusalem when they saw the star of the newborn king in the east. Now think that through. The wise men are coming from the east, traveling west. So the star that's in the east can't possibly be a star hovering over the eastern horizon. No, here the east doesn't refer to the direction east. It refers to the fixed constellation of the east, the constellation of Leo. They saw his star align with the constellation of kings. So what did they see, and when did they see it? Well, on September 11, 3 BC, Regulus, the star of kings, came into alignment with Jupiter, the planet of kings, in the constellation of the Lion of Judah. Then that same conjunction between Jupiter and Regulus was repeated not once but twice in February and May of 2 BC. And finally, in June of 2 BC, Jupiter and Venus, the two brightest objects in the sky, save the sun and the moon, experienced an even closer encounter when their disks appeared to touch, and to the naked eye they looked like a single object above the setting sun. This exceptionally rare spectacle could not have been missed by the wise men. In fact, the astrological significance of these events must surely have been seen by them as the announcement of the birth of the great king of Judah. And this alignment took place on the 17th of June, 2 BC. Now, I'll be saying more next week about that, but the 17th of June, 2 BC is very likely the date upon which Christ was actually born. But that's not the event that Matthew emphasizes in his gospel. Now, yes, I'm persuaded that that's the sign that the wise men saw before they left Persia and headed toward Jerusalem, the sign indicating the birth of Christ. But the sign we're concerned with this morning is the one that they saw when they left Jerusalem and headed for Bethlehem, the sign that has to do with Christmas. Because it was after they had met with Herod, that they saw the sign that Matthew mentions in Matthew 2:9. And behold, the star that they had seen when it rose went before them until it came to rest over the place where the child was. Now, stars, as we observe them here on earth, do not stop and stand stationary in the sky, but planets do. Now, to ancient astrologers, all heavenly lights were stars. They didn't know stars from planets, but they did know that some stars, some lights in the heavens, the ones that we know as planets, behave differently from the other stars. They just didn't know why, but we know why. Stars are distant objects in the galaxy, but planets are in orbit around the sun. And from our perspective here on Earth, planets normally move eastward through the stars from night to night and month to month, but at certain intervals they make what is known as a retrograde loop. As a planet approaches the opposite point in the sky from the sun, it appears to slow down, come to a full stop, and move backward, westward, through the sky for several weeks. Then again it slows down, stops, and resumes its eastward course. So if Jupiter is the star of Bethlehem, as most astronomers now think it was, then it makes perfect sense that as the wise men traveled southward from Jerusalem to Bethlehem, they saw his star, which at its stationary point was standing still geographically over the place where the young child was. So when, in this time frame, did Jupiter make such a loop? When was Jupiter standing still in the sky? Well, it can be established for a certainty that Jupiter performed a retrograde loop in the east in the last few weeks of 2 BC, and that it was standing stationary in the sky and from Jerusalem would have appeared to have been standing directly over Bethlehem on December 25, 2 BC. That's the date to which the stars point. That's the sign that the wise men saw that signified to them the location of Jesus, the sign that occurred on December 25, 2 BC. That's the day that the kings of the earth first worshiped Jesus as their king. That's the first time that the birth of Jesus was celebrated commemoratively. That's the first time that gifts were brought in celebration of the birth of Christ. Not on his birthday, but in commemoration of his birth. That was the first planned worship service in celebration of the birth of Christ ever performed by believers, by fellow followers of Christ. That's the first time that believers ever held a Mass in commemoration of the birth of Christ. December 25, 2 BC was the first Christ Mass, the first Christmas. Friends, according to Genesis 1:14, God said, "Let there be lights at set points in the heavens to serve as indices between days and between nights, and let them serve to mark signs and seasons and days and years." And according to Romans 1, the created order is a source of data which is trustworthy and reliable. And since time immemorial, men have sought to know the mind of God by studying the cosmos, by studying the stars. And one time, at least, one time for certain, a certain group of astrologers from Persia got it right. One time, at least, a band of stargazers discerned the mind of God through the observation of the heavens and found the Christ child. The wise men saw the sign in the heavens, and they interpreted it as a sign from God that a new king had been born in Judah. And they were right. They were right. And the sign that they saw pointed them directly to Christ. And that sign occurred on December 25, 2 BC. Now, beloved, that is not a contrivance of man. And that is not based on a pagan tradition. This was not an error, and it was not done in error. This was the sovereign hand of God directing those believers to worship the Son of God aright. So what about those pagan celebrations associated with December 25? What are we to make of the fact that long before the birth of Christ, pagans of every stripe from a variety of cultures celebrated the winter solstice on the 25th of December? What about Sol Invictus? What about Saturnalia? What about Mithra? What about the Day of Yule? What about Tammuz, the incarnation of Baal? What about the holly, the ivy, and evergreen, and the pagan symbols of eternal life? Well, what about them? I mean, as I've told you many times, Christ is the true light who comes from the God of light. The true light is the word that proceeded from the Father's mouth when he said, "Let there be." And his fingerprints are all over the creation. Christ and Christ alone is the true light, but there is refracted light everywhere you look. And there always has been. Now, if you want to hear more about that, I invite you to go online and listen to lesson number 248 in the Life of Christ series, Refracted Light. For the purposes of today's lesson, just know this: there's nothing at all surprising or alarming about the fact that multiple ancient cultures who knew nothing about the God of Israel and nothing about the Bible came to the conclusion long before the birth of Christ that there was something significant about the 25th of December. And that whatever that significance might be, it had something to do with light and renewal and eternal life. Because the creation itself testifies truthfully and reliably about the things of God, and according to Jesus in Matthew 7:8, everyone who asks receives, everyone who seeks finds, and everyone who knocks, the door will be opened to him. So it shouldn't surprise us that people seeking light and renewal and eternal life should home in on December 25th as the likely date for finding the same, because Jesus is the true light, and there is refracted light everywhere in the world, and there always has been. After all, it was God who said, "Let there be lights," at set points in the heavens to serve as indices between days and between nights, and let them serve to mark signs and seasons and days and years. And there's every indication that God chose this date to be the day of celebration even before he set the sun and the moon and the stars in motion. And somehow, a number of pagan cultures discerned that date and began to celebrate it even before the reality that gives that day its substance was ever manifested on earth. Now, if you want to hear more about that, I invite you to go online and listen to lesson number 351 there in the Life of Christ series, What is Truth? For the purposes of today's lesson, just know this: Christmas was never a pagan holiday. And its date was not chosen by the church because they were weak, corrupt, and eager to appeal to a thoroughly pagan world. I know that that's what you've been told all of your life, but it simply isn't so. The wise men did not choose that date based on pagan culture. No, Christmas has always been Christian. God set the sun and the moon and the stars in place to govern the earth and to serve as indices for the seasons, days, and years, ordaining that they should stand as markers differentiating one day from another and one night from another. And December 25, 2 BC is the date indicated by the astrological evidence as the day upon which the wise men from the east came to Bethlehem and worshiped the Lord in celebration of his birth. And celebrating the birth of Christ on that date is as biblical as you can get. It was never an error. Now, what about the other two dates that I mentioned to you? What about September 11, 3 BC? Well, there's biblical evidence to suggest that that was the date of the conception of Christ. And what about June 17, 2 BC? Again, there's biblical evidence to suggest that that's the date of the birth of Christ. Now, why should we care about that? Why does that matter? What's the significance of that? Come back next week, and I'll tell you. For the purposes of today's lesson, if you don't take anything else home with you today, take this home with you. Psalm 119:89, as it reads in the King James Version, says, "Forever, O Lord, thy word is settled in heaven." And it is, and there isn't anything wrong with that translation. But no fewer than 18 English translations of this verse render it, "Forever, O Lord, your word is firmly fixed in the heavens." Beloved, God is in control. God is sovereign. His light is his light. And he will shine it wheresoever and howsoever he wills. His truth is his truth. And he will tell it wheresoever and howsoever he wills. His word is his word. And he will reveal it wheresoever and howsoever he will. The wise men had only the Septuagint and the stars. That's all they had. And based on what they found revealed in those sources alone, they set out with complete confidence in God that he would lead them to the infant king. And they found him, and they didn't quibble about the date. It didn't bother them. It didn't bother them at all that everyone else in the region had set that day aside to immerse themselves in debauchery and saturnalia. They were confident that God had led them to Jesus right on time. And so am I. That's my lesson for today.